Welcome everyone to the East Hampton Library. I'm Andrea Meyer. I'm from the Long Island Collection, and this event is hosted by the Long Island Collection. Before I introduce our speaker, I just want to remind everyone that we have bathrooms to the back of the building here in the back of this room. We also have a fire escape over there, and the stairs that you came down also work should there be an emergency where that's needed. Our speaker tonight is Professor Ryan Carr, who teaches at Columbia University's Indigenous Studies Center. He focuses on the Native American Northeast and the interaction with colonial settlers and the Northeast transatlantic world. He's here to talk about his first book tonight, which focuses on Samson Occom. And I'm delighted to be able to say that Hampton has Ryan's book for sale in the back of the room tonight. We have Holly here, and I hope you will all be able to visit her, and we'll do questions at the end if that's okay. I will let Ryan do his.
Thank you so much. So as Andrea mentioned, I've just written this book about Samson Occom, who's a Mohegan-Brothertown minister, and I'm happy to talk as much as you all want about the book and the Q&A. The book is really focused on religion, and specifically it's focused on what it meant that Occom was an evangelical Christian. A lot of people have seen as a sign that he was a kind of non-traditional Native person. So in the book, I talk a lot about how actually if you try to understand what it meant to be a traditional Native person in the 18th century Occom's community, some of the customs that community had were actually kind of closely aligned with evangelical Christianity, in the sense that Native communities really prioritized loving people from all nations. and so evangelicalism, one way of understanding it is not so much a kind of logical or kind of odd, but just more of a style of being religious and being kind to strangers. So that's kind of the argument that I make in this book. As I said, I'd love to talk more about that, but I actually kind of wanted to develop some new ideas today that I've been thinking about that are related more to Montauk and to the politics of life. So I'm gonna focus on that, and it's connected to the religious stuff. But I hope that I appreciate your patience as I kind of try out some new thoughts. On September 13th, 1745, a group of native fishermen from the Mohegan tribe got on a small sailboat and set off from their homelands down the Thames River toward New London on the Connecticut coast. Working with and against the tide, it took them all of the first day just to reach New London, where they spent the night. They made better time the next day across the Sound, and by evening had landed at Montauk, where they were welcomed by members of the local native community. Montaukets hosted the Mohegans for about a week. The first night, they put the visitors up in their wigwams. On subsequent nights, the Mohegans probably camped. They were there mainly to fish, which they did for the better part of a week before packing up their camp and sailing back to Connecticut. Overall, it was a pretty uneventful trip, but for the Mohegans and the Montaukets, it was the beginning of something momentous, an intertribal friendship that would transform the region's native communities. Visitors, after all, didn't spend all their time fishing. One of the Mohegan fishermen wrote in his diary that we were very kindly entertained by all of them. We had several meetings together, and there was some stir amongst them. So what were these meetings and this stir about? Keeper of this diary was a 21-year-old Mohegan named Samson Occom. Occom loved to fish, but he also had other things on his mind. In fact, at the time of this fishing trip in 1745, he was a more or less full-time scholar preparing for a career in the ministry. 4 years earlier, his life had been upended when an itinerant preacher named James Davenport held a series of prayer meetings in New London, which Occom likely attended. This was the height of the so-called Great Awakening, a widespread religious revival that swept across the northeastern seaboard around 1740. This is kind of the most famous figure in the Great Awakening, George Whitefield, preaching to it. The Great Awakening, as you probably know, was associated with these kind of outdoor meetings for prayer and worship where people from all backgrounds kind of came together, and it's very unsettling because religious life in New England kind of big, almost like camp meetings were very upsetting to a lot of people, but this was kind of the beginnings of what we think of today. After coming into contact with the awakening as a 16-year-old, and Occom got to know George Whitefield, and he became Occom decided he needed to learn something about the Bible. He asked his mother to pay a visit to Eleazar Wheelock, a Yale-educated minister in Lebanon, Connecticut, and ask if he would teach Occom to read. Wheelock said yes, and as Occom later wrote in his autobiography, I went up to Lebanon thinking I should be back again in a few days. When I got up there, he received me with kindness and compassion, and instead of staying a fortnight or 3 weeks, I spent 4 years with him. Occom turned out to be extremely precocious, far exceeding the modest expectations of Wheelock and the other white New Englanders. Occom had grown up illiterate, but within a few months he was reading and writing both English and Latin, which was still at that time the language of learning in New England. So by the time of his fishing trip to Montauk, Occom and his teachers were fully expecting him to gain admission to Yale, study there for a career in the church. Previous summer, Wheelock had even dragged Occom down to New Haven to watch the college's commencement ceremony. Probably really boring. And that, that's to get to New Haven from Lebanon, Connecticut, you have to either go down the river and, through the Sound. And it's not trivial to travel or 50 miles overland from Lebanon, Connecticut to New Haven. What struck Wheelock about Occom was not just his scholarly acumen, but also his religious zeal. Occom gave every indication of being a passionate young preacher in training, and crucially, a willing missionary to the native communities of the Northeast, someone who could talk to them about matters spiritual in their own language. And as you probably know, Occom, who is from Mohegan, spoke, Mohegan is an Eastern Algonquian dialect, and so there's various, this is one of the major language families for the tribes of the North. Grew up in Mohegan, could understand and speak with people from, not people from the Iroquois language group in upstate New York. So when Occom wrote in his diary about how there was some stir amongst them when he was visiting Montauk, he was remembering the very beginnings of his career as a minister and missionary. He was, in a way, bringing the Great Awakening to Montauk, fishing for souls as well as for cod. Back in Connecticut, after his first trip to Montauk, Occom threw himself back into his studies. He read everything he could get his hands on, not just the Bible, although that's probably what he read most of all, but also handbooks of grammar and rhetoric, political pamphlets, works of theological disputation, and even classics of English literature like Pilgrim's Progress and Paradise Lost. A partial list of books that I'm pretty sure that Occom read because he either mentions them or cites them in his writings. It's a pretty wide-ranging list. And I thought I would just show you, this is one of my favorite books that survives from Occom's personal library. This is Dartmouth for many years and is now but as you'll see, this was at the top, it's signed by Samuel Buell from East Hampton. Occom got his hands on this book before he actually moved to Montauk, but it had been once owned by Buell, who was connected to his friends in Connecticut. And this gives you a sense of how deep Occom was in kind of the scholarly life. He was studying ancient Hebrew so that he could read them. Thing that, very few scholars did at the time. And this is a very interesting book for all kinds of reasons. It's the only book I think published in Hebrew characters in the 18th century. But Occom, it has these lavish inscriptions, writing in English as well as in grammar exercises. So he's trying out his Greek up there as well as his Latin. And there's these, students at that time did a lot of transcribing. So they would have one book in front of them and try to learn to write and to develop a nice hand as well as their language skills. So this is the kind of stuff he was reading. Grammar does all the art and knowledge teach, according to the life of every speech. Imagine, super dry. But there's also all this cool stuff in this particular book that, as you know, school children often like to write their names in books. And Occom did this in this book, where you can see him like trying to process and learn how to read Hebrew, biblical Hebrew. But he wrote this little flip book in his copy of the Hebrew grammar, Samson Occom of Mohegan-Brothertown, Librum. So I love that. Occom totally overdid it, it's fair to say, with these studies. 2 years after he came to Montauk for the first time, he was suffering from debilitating eye strain, had to put an end to his studies, at least temporarily. His plans to go to Yale had to be scrapped, which meant he needed to find a job. By this point, Occom had advanced more than enough in his education to work as a school teacher, and he set out to find a post working with one of the native communities of southern New England. He tried first at Niantic, just west of New London, but was told they already had a teacher. Then he paid a visit to the Narragansetts in present-day Rhode Island, but found that, quote, they were indifferent about school. Out of luck, Occom went back to Mohegan, where he learned about another fishing trip to Montauk. I went with them, he later remembered, and the Montauk Indians there were very desirous to have me keep a school amongst them. I consented. Occom moved to Montauk in 1749 to take up his new job and wound up staying for 12 years. Unfortunately, I don't have time today to tell you about everything Occom did during his time in Montauk. What I really want to focus on is the political significance of this period, but I can't resist telling you just a few other highlights about Occom's experience there. During the first few years he was at Montauk, Occom spent most of his time teaching. He reported having 30 scholars from the tribe the first year. Not an insignificant number, considering that the Montauk population, according to a 1741 census, which not totally accurate, amounted to fewer than 200 individuals. Among Occom students, one stood out as especially eager to learn. This was David Fowler, the eldest son of one of the biggest and most prosperous Montaukett families. Occom formed a connection with David Fowler that lasted until the end of his life. But he was even closer in the end with David's sister, Mary Fowler, with whom he formed a fast friendship. The couple got married in 1751 and would stay together until Occom's death 40 years later. And one of the, this marriage itself was politically significant because the colonial government in the 1720s had passed a law saying that Montaukett women, partly as a way of controlling the population. So the fact that Mary Fowler married Mohegan, a kind of act of defiance. And as some of you may know, that Mary Fowler was a very strong personality and is remembered as such. And after she and Samson Occom moved back to Connecticut, to Occom's homeland, she had the reputation of not Occom. You saw the picture of him. He dressed like an English minister, a gentleman in the English dress, at least. But Mary Occom always wore traditional Montaukett clothing, and one visitor even reported that when he stayed at their house, Samson Occom would speak to Mary in English, and she would respond to him in Montaukett. So she was a kind of she was a real traditionalist. During the first 12 years of their marriage, the Occom Fowler family grew quickly. Their children, Mary, Aaron, Tabitha, Olive, Christiana, Talitha, and Benoni, were all born at Montauk. As the family grew, the financial pressure on Mary and Samson was increasingly immense. Occom got some crucial help from Reverend Samuel Buell of East Hampton. Buell looms very large in East Hampton history, not always in a good way, as many of you probably know. He was a slaveholder, and more generally something of a local potentate who threw his weight around town with a strongly patriarchal attitude. His reputation today is deservedly mixed, I think. But there's no doubt that he was a key supporter of Occom, who considered Buell perhaps his closest white friend. In the 1750s, Buell was able to pull strings with missionary agencies in Boston and Scotland in order to get Occom a small salary for his teaching. Buell also encouraged Occom to consider his studies, to continue his studies for the ministry in private, even though his chance to attend Yale had passed. And when Occom was finally ordained as a Presbyterian minister in 1759, the first time a Native person was ever ordained in a Protestant church, although there had been Native ordination in the Catholic Church. It was Buell who preached the sermon at the ceremony here in East Hampton on August 29th of that year. And this, the sermon was published and is actually a very fascinating, I would say important sermon from the kind of Great Awakening era that about Occom, and in the sermon, Buell kind of reflects on what it means, perspective of theology and biblical thinking about the history. Buell interprets it. This is interesting. Part of Buell's argument is that if you think about, even today, American evangelicals like to read the Bible. If you do that in the 18th century and you're thinking about a Native American convert, what you're thinking about is like what the Apostle Paul says about the Gentiles who were not trained in the Jewish faith, had no acquaintance with Scripture, being called into the religion, starting to preach. So Buell drew a parallel between Occom and the kind of non-Jewish pagans of the ancient world, who were the Christians who in a way really proved that this Jewish Messiah, if you like. Anyway, really interesting sermon. Despite Buell's support, though, the Occom Fowler family was still desperately poor. Occom later remembered how during his time here, I took all opportunities to get something to feed my family daily. Planted my own corn, potatoes, and beans. I used to be out hoeing my corn, sometimes before sunrise and after my school is dismissed. By this means, I was able to raise my own pork, for I was allowed to keep 5 swine. Some mornings and evenings, I would be out with my hook and line to catch fish, and in the fall and in the spring, I used my gun, for we lived very handy for fowl, and I was very expert with gun, and fed my family with fowl. I could more than pay for my powder and shot with feathers. At other times, I bound books for East Hampton people, made wooden spoons and ladles, stacked guns, and worked on cedar to make pails, etc. And when I first came to East Hampton a couple years ago, because I was looking through the catalog of the Long Island collection, and I found that there were some of these books that were bound by Occom, which are still collection. And Andrea helped me. I spent a lot of time with them, and we're here in this building. These are books bound by Occom in the 1750s. A rather unconventional leather binding for a book. If you've seen 18th century books, I guess it's a kind of whip stitching. I'm not really an expert in bibliography, but I know it's. And other books that he bound look more like this, the somewhat more familiar kind of look with the embossed decorations. And I think there's probably 5 or 6 books upstairs. And he bound all sorts of stuff, political pamphlets, some things that he kept, some things that I think he probably was. Binding books was had to do in the 18th century. Come from the factory already bound. So this is another book that is upstairs. One of the more important books as from a kind of religious historical perspective that Occom bound and read very closely, which is called Freedom of the Will by Jonathan Edwards, who was probably the most important. Some say he's pretty much the most important American philosopher. I'll follow Emerson in the. Edwards was the kind of theological inspiration for the American. Occom was very fascinated by him, and in my book I talk a lot more about that. So I could spend all day really talking about the things that Occom read and wrote while he was here on Long Island. But what I'd really like to do in the rest of my time is step back a little bit and talk about this political issue. What was happening politically when Occom was here in Montauk? Specifically, I want to talk about Occom's work with the Fowler family and many other Indigenous families from around Montauk who helped Occom found a new Native nation called Brothertown. This story begins in 1761, 2 years after Occom's ordination. One of the reasons Occom had been ordained in 1759 was because he needed that qualification in order to serve as a missionary to the Cherokee Nation, a plan that he, Buell, other church leaders had devised some years earlier. Occom's Cherokee mission was canceled shortly after his ordination, but the organization that had sponsored it the New York correspondents of the Scotch Society for Propagating Christian Knowledge, NYCSSPCK, if you want to write it down, came up with a new plan instead. This was to send Occom, together with his Montaukett brother-in-law, David Fowler, to Oneida Territory in present-day upstate New York. Occom and Fowler stayed in Oneida from June to November 1761. They operated a school there with mixed success, but they also learned a lot from the Oneidas about their traditions, about their Iroquoian language, and about the political challenges facing the people of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy. So this is the famous Six Nations that the tribes of upstate New York who spoke their own language group. And the relationship between Haudenosaunee and Algonquian tribes in this period is really fascinating. Occom would return to Oneida again in 1762 and 1763, and Fowler went back in 1765 and spent the better part of 5 years among the Oneida. And not clear how successful Occom or Fowler were in converting the Oneidas to their peculiar form of Protestantism that they practiced down on the eastern seaboard. But they made a lot of friends in Oneida territory, and they also took note of how few white people there were, at least compared to thickly settled areas like Long Island and southern Connecticut. In fact, it would be hard to overstate how much pressure colonists were placing on the Mohegans, Montaukets, and other coastal Algonquian tribes by the 1760s. Almost a century earlier, in 1687, the Montaukett sachem Paniute had sold the last of the tribe's ancestral lands to the town of East Hampton in exchange for £100 and a guarantee from the town that the Montaukett people would be able to live on their homelands in perpetuity. This turned out not to be an especially good deal for the Montaukets, especially because the people of East Hampton had such a hard time fulfilling their end of the bargain. It took nearly 20 years for the tribe to receive the money they were promised. Meanwhile, East Hampton residents let their livestock run amok on the lands east of town. Pigs tore up shellfish beds, which for centuries had been one of the tribe's main sources of subsistence. White farmers fenced in tracts of Montaukett land, claiming they belonged to the town of East Hampton. By the time Occom arrived in Montauk in 1749, the tribe was finding it almost impossible to carry out their traditional subsistence. Things were not much better on the other side of Long Island Sound. In the Mohegan and Stonington Pequot nations, tribal members also lived mostly on lands held in trust, or reserved, as they called it, by the Crown. These communities, this is the British Crown, and I'll talk more about the relationship between the Crown and the tribes. These communities also had to deal with white incursions on lands reserved for native use. At Mohegan, there were also political problems within the tribe. In the 1760s and 1770s, the Mohegan sachem Ben Uncas II had started leasing tribal lands to white farmers without approval from the tribal council. Occom, who had moved back to Mohegan with his family in 1763, and who had inherited a seat on the Mohegan Council from his father, was furious. And many other Mohegans despised the leasing scheme. They also accused the sachem and his followers of colluding with Connecticut Colony, whom Ben Uncas's followers had invited to Mohegan to keep an eye on tribal affairs. It was around this time that the idea of Brothertown first emerged. This was to be a new tribe, an amalgamation of families from 7 coastal Algonquian communities: Narragansett, Niantic, Groton Pequot, Stonington Pequot, Tunxus, Montauk, and Mohegan. The aspiration of Brothertown's founding families was to build a new home together, farther away from the colonial population centers of the eastern seaboard. In April 1773, these families held a planning meeting at Occom's home in Mohegan. The following summer, Occom's son-in-law, Joseph Johnson, traveled to Oneida Territory, where he reestablished the connections with tribal leaders that Occom and Fowler had made the decade before. Joseph Johnson successfully negotiated a land grant from the Oneidas, who deeded to the New England Indians, called them, a plot of land about 15 miles southwest of Utica, near Deansboro, neither town existed at the time, although Utica was the site of Fort Shannon. Had a small settlement. Migration to Brothertown began shortly thereafter, but was suspended following the onset of the American Revolution. It resumed in the mid-1780s with Fowler and Occom, now in his 60s, leading several contingents of Montauks and Mohegans on the long trip up the Hudson and Mohawk rivers to their new homestead. This shows the kind of composition of generations of Brothertown, and really I think is relevant partly because of the large number of Montauk and Mohegan families as well. I mean, even in Mohegan, Samson Occom is I think kind of revered as a very important. Also have justifiably mixed feelings about him, because this was a movement that took a lot of post, and I think that kind of consideration obviously would have been. So this is not just all good. Migration to Brothertown. On November 7th, 1785. After the Revolutionary War, the main hostilities had ended and people were finally settling in their new land. Brothertown's founding families gathered for a fateful meeting recorded by Samson Occom in his diary. In the evening, we met on our temporal and religious concerns. Now we proceeded to form into a body politic. We named our town by the name of Brotherton, in Indian, Ayakwituwakanuk. Concluded to live in peace and in friendship and to go on in all our public concerns in harmony, both in religious and temporal concerns, and everyone to bear his part of the public charges of the town. This meeting marked the official founding of the Brothertown Indian Nation. So, partly because the 4th of July is coming up, I think it's important to emphasize just how amazing this is. It's coming together of families from different tribal nations to form a new body politic in 17. Think about what else was happening in North America around that time. Declaration of Independence had taken place on July 4th, 1776. The 13 colonies had rebranded themselves as the United States. That's it. In 1783, after their defeat in the Revolutionary War, the British relinquished sovereignty over the US in the Treaty of Paris. But it wasn't until 1787 that the United States Constitution was drafted. Ratification didn't happen until 1788, and George Washington wasn't elected president until 1789. What this implies, I think, is that Brothertown, founded in November 1785, beat the USA to the punch. It was the original American Republic, the first sovereign nation to navigate the chaos of the Revolutionary era and emerge on the other side as a united people. Now, obviously, Brothertown was and remains nowhere near as big. But it's still worthwhile to reflect on the fact that the USA wasn't the only republic to be created. Creation of Brothertown forces us to rethink that straightforward, unilinear narrative of the American founding that many of us probably learned in school. If you're like me, you grew up thinking that the colonial period in American history ended with the Declaration of Independence in 1776, the year when a new nation was conceived in liberty. Over the last few years, Americans, I think, have become increasingly aware of how this patriotic narrative of the US founding obscures the histories of Black and Indigenous peoples who inhabited in North America along with the USA's white founders. We know now that the colonial period of American history did not really end in 1776, that the USA would rapidly emerge as an empire in its own right, albeit an empire of liberty, as Thomas Jefferson famously called it. For now, though, I'm somewhat less interested in debunking high school history than I am in this issue of multiple American foundings taking place in the 1780s. I don't have time today to do justice to the richness of or complexity of Brothertown history. Worth knowing a few key facts. First, and most importantly, Brothertown still exists as a sovereign Native nation, with headquarters in Fond du Lac, Wisconsin, south shore of Lake Winnebago. Brothertown retains the same governmental institutions it established in the 18th century, an elected tribal council and a board of peacemakers, which serve as a court of appeals for controversies falling under tribal jurisdiction. The peacemaker system was established not in this meeting, but a couple years later in 1798. David Fowler was the first chief head of the judicial branch. You may wonder why Brothertown is in Wisconsin. which is a very long story. The bottom line is that upstate New York turned out not to be the refuge from colonialism that the tribe had hoped. After nearly half a century living next to the Oneida, Brothertown joined many other East Coast tribes and headed west. First to northern Indiana, and then in the 1830s to Calumet County, Wisconsin. During this era, Brothertown, like other Indian tribes, dealt with the United States as a foreign. They signed treaties and other legal instruments of the kind that are only binding on foreign states. It was, in the terminology of US Indian law, a government-to-government relationship. Then, in 1839, the United States passed this document, an act for the relief of the Brothertown Indians, which made the people of Brothertown United States citizens while simultaneously denying their right to self-government. This was, for all sorts of reasons, a terrible act on Congress's part, and Brothertown is still trying to reverse it. Even to this day, the US Bureau of Indian Affairs maintains that Brothertown had all the rights of tribal sovereignty up until this moment, that another act of Congress is all that would be required to get Brothertown's sovereignty restored. But with that history in mind, let's go back to Brothertown's beginnings, to the period when the tribe still resided in New York and when no one contested their sovereignty. Specifically, let's go back to this moment. This moment, when the Brothertown founders came together to form a new independent body politic. Given Brothertown's legal standing as a tribal nation with the authority to engage in government-to-government relations with the USA and other sovereign states, it seems to me that this agreement starts to look a lot like a constitution, or perhaps a Declaration of Independence and a constitution all rolled into one. Yet it's important to be careful here. These terms, Constitution, Declaration of Independence, are so freighted with significance for US citizens that they can easily distort what the Brothertown founders thought they were doing when they created their new nation. For instance, this Brothertown Agreement does not do what the United States Constitution does. That is, it does not codify and make explicit a supreme law of the land, originating in the collective will of the people. This Brothertown document doesn't have articles or sections specifying the powers of various governmental entities. Rather, it appoints specific people to specific offices, assuming that everyone already knows what those offices are. What's happening here, then, is less the creation of fundamental positive law than a recommitment to long-standing norms and procedures to a new group of people. It might be helpful here to think about the common law as understood in the Anglo-American tradition. That is, a set of unwritten and therefore constantly evolving norms belonging or common to a people over a long period of time. In the 17th and 18th centuries, this common law was sometimes said to derive from England in its so-called ancient constitution, unwritten system of rights and liberties that were binding on the English people as a whole, including even the monarch, at least according to the English Revolution. The common law was seen as the Parliament appealed to the common law rights and privileges of English citizens against the monarch, who was supposed to be usurping the prerogatives that the ancient. Took someone like Thomas Hobbes, actually the monarch has a lot of people in England didn't. Definitely most people in the States or in the American colonies weren't thinking about it that way. This set of ideas, the common law and ancient constitution, shaped how people in colonial North America understood the sovereignty of native nations during this period, including the Mohegan Nation. In the 1740s, for instance, the Mohegans brought a case against their own sachem before the Royal Commissioners of Review, royal tribunal that traveled to North America to try some of these cases. The Mohegans were protesting against the rule of Ben Uncas, whom they accused of being a usurper and ceding tribal lands illegally under pressure from the colonial government. It is apparent, this was the argument of the Mohegan tribe in court, it is apparent from his conduct that this pretended sachem Ben has sold himself to the governor and company and is endeavoring to sell the whole tribe, or, which is the same thing, their ancient and rightful inheritance as fast as he can. And the said Mohegan Indians deny the said Ben to be their rightful chief, sachem, according to the ancient established constitution of their tribe. This sense of constitution, the long established set of governmental norms rather than a written document, seems quite relevant to me to understanding what was happening at Brothertown in the 1780s. That's because this notion of an ancient constitution, its association with the common law, that is a law common to one people as distinct from another, places the emphasis on culture, on the embeddedness of law in a specific community's history. It makes sense to speak of the Brothertown founders as having a constitution. I think it was this kind and not the kind we have in the US today, which is, after all, a multicultural society where we expect the law not to discriminate between people. So what about the idea of declaring independence? Now, there can be no doubt that Brothertown was doing that in its way on this day in November 1785, but not in the same way as Thomas Jefferson and the other white patriots of 1776. The Harvard historian David Armitage has persuasively argued in a wonderful book called Declaration of Independence, A Global History. That document is best understood as an event in the history of international law. Think about Jefferson's first sentence. When in the course of human events, it becomes necessary for one people to dissolve the political bands which have connected another, and to assume among the powers of the earth the separate and equal station to which the laws of nature and nature's God entitle them, a decent respect to the opinions of mankind requires that they should declare the causes which impel them to the separation. Note the language in bold. The powers of the earth, laws of nature, opinions of mankind are the rhetorical hallmarks of international law as it was emerging in the 18th century, or what was back then called the law of nations. Independence, from this point of view, meant being able to throw your weight around on the global stage, to wage war and enter into alliances with other countries. Above all, from the perspective of the US patriots, it meant getting recognized by other European powers as a legitimate combatant in the war against Great Britain. Revolutionary republic as distinct from a mere insurgency or a provincial disturbance within the British Empire. Now, this kind of international law rhetoric is almost entirely absent from all of the proclamations, treaties, and laws enacted by the Brothertown Nation in the first half century of its existence. Declaring independence for Brothertown didn't require appealing to some international tribunal. So when in the Declaration, Jefferson writes that we have to have a decent respect to the opinions of mankind, even though they didn't have the modern institutions of it. Jefferson was kind of imagining a situation where someone in the international sphere could say, "Oh, that nation has the right to exist." So it's this kind of appeal to the general opinions of civilized nations that's really missing actually from the Brothertown documents. Another difference between the Brothertown, what I'm calling the Brothertown Declaration / Constitution documents, or the U.S. documents, is that if you think about the Declaration of Independence, it was actually printed before it was written. So Philadelphia, obviously, there was a manuscript that had to be turned into type, but the famous kind of manuscript version of the Declaration, not the original version. That's authentic, and the published version. That's because the founders of the U.S. wanted to be able to widely this document because they wanted mankind in general to be able to get a copy of it. You know, if you have a manuscript that you don't show to anyone, it doesn't work that way. And it's very striking that the Brothertown founding documents, none of them circulated publicly. They were all just for private, in a way, use or domestic. They were never published until the. So for Brothertown, it wasn't really about appealing to this court of public opinion. It was really about creating a political home, domestic political space, where tribal members could petition the government and settle their own disputes with the help of the peacemakers. International law just didn't really come into it. That's not to say that the Brothertown founders lacked a foreign policy. Diplomacy, after all, was a huge part of Native life and had been since long before the arrival. But in the 18th century, tribal relations with foreign powers, including the fledgling United States, did not take place within the context of what we now call the rules-based. Diplomacy happened more directly, one-on-one, between native states and each other, or between native states and the British sovereign. At least that's how it usually happened. It was always possible for tribal members to strike deals with lesser colonial entities. Indeed, this was often how native communities lost control of tribal lands. Some native individual or group of individuals would claim private ownership of tribal land, or alternatively, they would claim the authority to negotiate on behalf of the whole tribe. Such deals were often highly divisive within native, and tribal leaders worked to limit such backdoor dealings. Before the revolution, native leaders often did this by complaining directly to the British sovereign, that is the king, and making the case that his subjects were undermining legal agreements that tribes had made directly with the crown. And actually, before he founded Brothertown and after he lived in Montauk, Samson Occom traveled to England, partly for a bunch of reasons, one of which was so that he could make a series of legal arguments with the royal about how the colony of Connecticut, before statehood, there were all sorts of ways in which the colony of Connecticut invalid contracts, he argued. Tribal member can go directly to the king, and that gives you leverage over the colony. And so here's another famous example of this kind of diplomacy that native tribes undertook before the revolution. So this is a petition from the Narragansett tribe to the crown from 1640. Sense of how this diplomacy with the crown worked. So the Narragansetts are they willingly and submissively acknowledge ourselves to be the humble, loving, and obedient servants upon condition of His Majesty's royal. Look, this is a deal. We'll be your subject. We'll fighting of us what is wrong us, or may be done unto us according to exercise the rule of law impartially, like you do with your own. And this is the having ourselves been the chief sachem. So this is an example of how tribal nations sought to go straight to the head of sovereignty, which was how they refused to be bound by legal agreements that they made. Subjects themselves, i.e. colonists. So one consequence of the American Revolution, and I think a consequence most people aren't aware of, was that native tribes could no longer make this kind of argument. They could no longer petition against the operations or exercise of colonialism by appealing directly to the sovereign across the Atlantic. Instead, they had to deal directly with their former enemies, the colonists on their doorstep. This would prove a very hard road indeed. If you're interested in more reading about any of this, these are some of the sources I used, and these are all really great works. My own book.
I just wanted to say, well, questions now, and ready, I can kind of go around the room and see if anybody's ready for a question.
Village in New York that was Brothertown. Do you know what the name of the village is now?
Well, I think that I was there last year with Brothertown tribe members, and we spent most of our time in Deansboro.
Yeah, it is Deansboro. Yeah. My name is Dean.
Oh, there you go. I met a Dean. Yeah, you're still around. Deansboro, yeah. The mayor of Deansboro actually gave a little speech.
Same trail that went through the middle.
Well, David Fowler's house is actually still on.
As Andrea knows, and she may have mentioned this to you, we have been working hard off and on to preserve the Fowler house that was moved here when the Fowlers were basically told to get out of Montauk, and the house was moved to Springs Fireplace Road. And the gentleman worked for the Moran family as a handyman, painter, etc., and rode his gondola on town pond. Mr. Fowler did. So, we are trying to preserve that house. In the basement, I think Andrea also knows, our archaeologist, Allison McGovern, found bits of shell that had been used as wampum, also boots from World War I, because the Fowler family had sent its 3 boys to war, and also other bits and pieces of materials under the house, and the house apparently originally had raised many children, although it's quite small. Have you seen it?
I've seen pictures.
It's quite small, but there's an attic space where you can bed down a lot. And Mr. Fowler worked as a gardener in many different families around town. He knew a lot about horticulture. And the property in the back was his wife's and has now been combined, I believe, by the town. And we would love very much to be able to move forward with that. But with the governor not accepting the Montaukets as a tribe, there's a lot of the diaspora is unhappy. And so is the town of East Hampton. Thank you.
Who has, well, we're recording here, so
Town or any in churches?
Like copies of hymns or?
Yeah, some of the hymns that he wrote. Do you know if they're in our churches here in East Hampton?
I think that Occom's hymns appeared in some hymnals. I don't know if there's any. They're a little bit, they're a little old-fashioned. Let's just put it that way. But they're beautiful. I mean, if in their way, if you're steep. Wrote 6 original hymns.
I understand. Thank you. You mentioned earlier about Jonathan Edwards, and I think most people have read some of his sermons, particularly Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God. And we are also generally familiar with the Puritan tradition and the juxtaposition of Native Americans and Christianity and so forth, the half-naked, so-called, as opposed to the black-hatted and frocked coat, probably led to a lot more dissonance on both sides of that line. So,
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, Brothertown has sometimes been described as a kind of that took tribal families away from their more traditional. Some people, there's a grain of truth to that. I think my personal view is that Brothertown wasn't quite as religiously, but there's no doubt that there was arguably most people were not. But I mean, I guess part of what I'm trying to do in my work and in the book is just to say, rather than thinking of it as a simple betrayal of Native lifeways, it was a way for some Native people to organize and form a new, have sovereignty in a different way. So it's just a complicated story, and I think it's important not to judge some people for taking having their own laws and things like that. Edwards, his opinions about Native people were pretty different from Occom's, you know.
So what precipitated that in 1839, the act?
It's a good question. I think it was, you know, it's complicated, but it's partly, I think some people at Brothertown thought that one way to stay together as a community amid this kind of ongoing pressure from mostly migrants from the East was to become private landowners, to actually have private allotments. So I think that there was some support within the tribe to that kind of started. I think U.S. seized on that as a kind of, oh, well, they want to be like U.S. have a yard and have their own farm. So I think that it'd be misleading to say that it's entirely one-sided act on Congress's part. But I think that, you know, the people of Brothertown that I talked to today, I think rightly argue that it's not so much that Brothertown, again, was capitulating to a kind of it's rather that they just wanted to stay where they were, you know, and they thought that they had seen so many times various governments find different ways of let's give it a try and go private, and that's what happened, you know. But their goal was the same. They wanted to have a nation.
Hi, I just want to make a mention to the lady in the first row who was really upset with the town of East Hampton and the Fowler House. Just to let you know on a different note that my husband and I, next to our house in Amagansett, we had a 2-acre empty lot that we were going to sell to a contractor, you know, to buy the land, build a house, do whatever he wanted with it. When we found there were 23 Montauk Indian teepee indentations all over the land. So what we did, we sold it to the town of East Hampton, where it will forever be preserved and nobody will ever touch it at all.
Thank you. This is tangential to the discussion of Brothertown, but the whole the kind of aura around Samson Occom of collecting the money, going to England and collecting the money for the form college. And now listening to you today, I'm thinking to myself, was that really enhanced by the fact that he did have this deep religious background? Village to village, church to church. I mean,
Yeah, I'd love to. So yeah, I mean, Occom was really in demand as an itinerant preacher in New England and Long Island. He traveled all over Long Island preaching. But so by the time he went. So the backstory here is that his teacher got it in his head to start a new school first based near Lebanon, Connecticut, Then Wheelock decided that if he raised a lot of capital, he could turn this. So he called up Occom, or wrote to him, and he said, "Why don't you go to England and Scotland and Ireland and do a preaching?" That's what. And Occom he raised a lot of money. He raised at the time. He brought it back, and Wheelock basically betrayed his promise and took the money. Have a Native student for the. But the bottom line is that's a whole another story. But to answer your question, people in England were just fascinated by Occom. And it's partly, going back to Buell's ordination sermon, it has partly to do with like, I think the fact, Occom was like a very charismatic and interesting person. But it's also that, again, he was a Native American. He just embodied something that had like real religious significance. Kind of like if you can imagine what it was like to see Frederick Austin in 17. Like he actually is that person. Like Occom actually is had this kind of, as you said, an aura around him. And as people did at that time, if you're going to these sermons, you're probably apology of some people really thought that Occom was the beginning of the end of history, you know. Evidence that God's plan is moving ahead, you know, where we can get ready for like a historical society, all this correspondence between Occom and people in England, kind of mystical experiences. Thank you.
I'd just like to remind everyone that we do have Brian's book in the back, so feel free to visit the table.